Good morning. I'm delighted to be joined today by our expert partners, Joanna Millar, Legal Director at Gilson Gray, and Derek Nicol, Accounts Executive at Bruce Stevenson Insurance Brokers, to learn more about what is meant by the term the uninsurable risk, what's happening with the Financial Conduct Authority test case, and why you should be sure that you've got the right insurance policy in place for your properties, and also why there's a need to review your booking terms and conditions in light of this rather extraordinary year. Derek's worked as an insurance broker for over 30 years and for the last 15 specialising in private clients in the hospitality sector. He heads up Bruce Stevenson's Stay Safe Self-Catering scheme, which has doubled its client base in the last 12 months. He's recognised in the sector as someone who understands the market and how best to protect clients' interests. Jo is a legal director with Gilson Gray. She has been qualified over 25 years and during that time has specialised in licensing and corporate law. Prior to joining Gilson Gray in November 2019, Joanna ran her own firm. Her team moved as an entirety over to Gilson Gray, but this background means that she really does understand firsthand the challenges which face owner-operated and small, medium-sized businesses. Before I introduce you to today's panelists, I thought I'd give you a bit of a potted background in terms of business interruption insurance and the uninsurable risk. So, society as a whole could not have quantifiably predicted the outbreak of COVID-19. I'm sure if we look back on this time last year, we simply didn't see it coming. Pretty much every insurance company has specific exclusions to notifiable diseases, as well as pandemics. Exclusions for the spread of viruses and other communicable diseases is more absolute than common in commercial property policies. As such, the business interruption elements of these policies, which rely on a peril within the commercial property policy being activated in order to respond, are rendered obsolete. This is known as the material damage proviso. I knew nothing of these insurance terms before this year. Anyway, 99% of businesses are simply not covered by business interruption insurance. The spread of viruses and other communicable diseases are largely excluded from policies because they're known as uninsurable risks. In other words, they're risks that simply cannot be quantified at the point of sale of the policy and therefore are written out of the policy by underwriters. Some policies do cover an outbreak of disease within a certain proximity of the insured premises, but policies such as this are likely not to be intended to cover countrywide or even regional mandatory lockdown situations. This is because such an event would almost certainly cause insolvency issues for insurers, which would lead to inflated pricing and, frankly, fewer insurers. There are, however, a few insurance policies that would cover business interruption on the grounds of it being a notifiable disease. Let's not forget that COVID-19 became a notifiable disease on the 5th of March this year. On the 18th of March of this year, which seems like several lifetimes ago, I wrote to the Chancellor to encourage the UK government to insist on a relaxation in the mid-term policy wording for the major insurers who have specified notifiable diseases for 12 months. If that were to be the case, anyone with cover including notifiable diseases would also be covered by COVID-19. Royal Sun Alliance, for example, which does cover notifiable diseases, including coronavirus, incidentally, states that cover will be forthcoming if closure or restrictions are placed on the premises on advice or with the approval of the medical officer of health of the public authority as a result of a notifiable human disease manifesting itself at the premises. Now, this caused a problem. An individual business would have to be shut down by an authority or government in order for cover to be attached. However, back in March, government policy was that there would be no community testing, so manifesting itself was impossible. Despite the UK government announcement in March that we were to go into a national lockdown, the insurance companies simply did not step up to help. So fast forward, and as a result of significant lobbying, the Financial Conduct Authority brought the insurers to court. So I'd like to introduce Derek. Derek, can you elaborate on the FCA test case and why insurance cover is still instrumental in protecting your business and property assets, regardless of the outcome?
Absolutely. Good morning, Fiona, and good morning to everyone else who's joined us today. A huge thanks to Fiona and team for inviting me along today. Insurance is not the most interesting of subject matter, so apologies in advance. Just a quick Background firstly, I head up, as Fiona said, the bed and breakfast and self-catering scheme at Bruce Stevenson. Bruce Stevenson are Scotland's largest independent broker with a gross written premium of 40 million. And our scheme, our self-catering scheme, is managed by Fiona Reid from our office in the Scottish Borders. So Fiona asked if I would discuss in particular the FCA case today and where we are, and I'm more than happy to do that. Firstly, business interruption insurance was traditionally designed to provide cover relative to the inability to trade following physical damage at the insured's premises. Over the years, and in response to demand, insurers have extended the standard cover to include interruption arising from damage to neighbouring premises, such as denial of access, in addition to including what we would describe as non-damage extensions, where cover is triggered by circumstances not relative to or originating from physical damage at all. An example is an extension providing cover relative to notifiable human disease. The topic of business interruption alone can be complex without the addition of such extensions added to this. The extensions available can vary between insurers and indeed their policies. Fiona mentioned RSA, for example, there, and RSA will probably have in excess of 20 different wordings applicable to the hospitality sector. So whilst RSA might be compelled to pay out eventually as a result of the FCA ruling, it will not mean that all RSA policies will be subject to the same ruling, because you will have a varied number of policy wordings in the market. The FCA took a selection of policy wordings forward to the High Court for review, putting forward their case regarding the interpretation of cover and giving the opportunity for each insurer involved to respond. It's important to note that it would be impossible for the case to address all possible disputes, but the intent was to resolve some key contractual uncertainties and main causation issues. Causation relates to the main basis upon which the claim is presented, i.e. is what's happening to create the loss. The judgment from the case will also not determine the amount payable for claims presented, but will provide the basis for doing so. On the 15th of September, the High Court handed down its judgment on the case. As you may have read in the media, however, the case has now gone to appeal. The FCA and the courts recognise that the crisis of the pandemic and the effect on business requires the issues to be resolved as quickly as possible, and so the appeal has referred immediately to the Supreme Court, which is the final court for appeal and the highest court in the UK. The appeal hearings were held between the 16th and 19th of November, and the outcome is now awaited. The justices again recognise the need for early judgment. However, they would not commit to advising whether the decision would be made before Christmas or in January. A further update regarding the timescales attached to this is now awaited via the FCA. The eventual judgment will be legally binding on all insurers involved in the case in relation to the interpretation of the sample of policy wordings considered by the court. This will subsequently provide influence for the interpretation of similar policy wordings and claims. So aside from continually monitoring case progression, what have Bruce Stevenson done? You may be aware that Bruce Stevenson are part of a larger independent group of brokers called UNA. So with them, we've held regular virtual meetings with the heads of claims within each brokerage to share experience and use our strength as a group during discussions with insurers, invested in securing independent legal advice regarding not only the judgment and the impact to our clients, but also the firm's assistance with eventual settlement negotiations where the judgment dictates that a claim is to be valid. We've also sought to ensure that each client with a live claim is kept apprised of developments ahead of any insurer correspondence. We've compiled a database of clients and wordings, either matching the policies subject to review in test cases or similar to them, so that in the event of a judgment indicating cover could be triggered, we will then make immediate contact with these clients so that they've got the right to progress a claim. There have been a couple of people who have contacted us recently concerned that their claim may be time barred. but it won't be. You'll have up to 6 years in which to make a valid claim should the insurance company have to settle your claim. So don't worry if a claim hasn't been submitted to date. Once the ruling has been finalised, if you haven't made a claim, you'll be perfectly entitled to do so. We've also provided separate independent advice to our clients regarding other resources available to assist their business whilst their test case is pending. So that's where we are with the FSA ruling. In terms of insurable risk, I would argue that most things are actually insurable, but that's based on appetite and cost. So they may as well be uninsurable, depending on the cost element involved. In respect to disease cover, I can with quite some confidence state prior to this year, I have never been asked what the disease cover is under an insurance policy, perhaps with the exception of Legionnaire's disease, which does historically has cropped up now and again. It's no great surprise, nobody asked about terrorism cover until 9/11. So it's that same type of scenario that we're dealing with. The argument is whether an insurer can reasonably be expected to pick up the cost of business interruption as a result of a worldwide pandemic. I would suggest that if they did, and Fiona already alluded to this, the premiums would increase astronomically in order to cover the potential payout. As a result, many would choose not to take the cover as it would be cost prohibitive. So then the onus is back on the client again. We do have government-backed schemes, such as Flood Re, so that may be an option going forward, a government-backed scheme. However, Flood Re hasn't really worked as promised either. We've still got a significant number of clients with private dwellings or commercial properties that are still unable to access flood cover. So when they do access the flood cover, again, the premium can be quite a shock to the system. So it's perhaps not the waving of the magic wand that we hoped government intervention and backing would give the sector. We have been working with existing and new clients to get a full understanding of their businesses and to ensure that as best we can, we cover their needs and requirements. Our own policy was not considered as part of the FCA ruling. However, we await the outcome of the appeal to see if it exerts additional pressure on the insurers to pay. It's been the most challenging time for our clients, and we've ensured that at all times we've been on the end of the phone or replying to emails promptly. There's nothing more frustrating than a client not being able to get a response, particularly at a time like this. Interestingly, during this difficult period, what's been highlighted is how inadequate a lot of our clients' policies actually are, or were, and generally aside from the business interruption issue. Some clients have policies which seem far more designed for private residences rather than a business property, which is most unusual. You know, if you've got a client with a residential property owner's portfolio, it's business first, and it's almost secondary that it's somewhere that somebody stays. Whereas the reverse almost seems to apply in respect to the self-catering, is that a lot of clients consider it to be a holiday home type scenario, and the insurance is being bolted on in that way rather than be specific for a business purpose. So we try to address and go that out. Nobody wants to test the validity of their policy when they make a claim. So it's really important that they review their cover and make sure that the key covers are in place. These key covers will be property damage, including by guests, liability to guests, which I'm sure Joe will know a lot about. People are particularly litigious these days, so if there's an opportunity to get your holiday for free or to make a nice big lump sum, then they're all over it. So yeah, liability to guests is hugely important. And business interruption following the material damage and non-material damage extensions where possible. Also, I would ask to check your non-occupancy condition and if there's any exclusions or warranties which may apply to your policy. Again, you don't want to test your policy by making a claim. You want to know well in advance that you've got the correct cover in place. And my own diary is normally full with appointments across our beautiful country, visiting existing and new self-catering clients. This has been significantly curtailed this year, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to get back out and see my clients once more. If an appraisal and review meeting would be of value to you, then that's what we do. So I pop out and see clients and we make sure that they've got the correct cover in place. Clients with multiple policies on various renewal dates, one surefire way of reducing your overall costs is by trying to get them under one policy. You would remove all that duplication, and that can only serve to bring your premiums down. So if there's one recommendation today for people that have multiple properties, make sure you get that housekeeping in order. Get one renewal date, so you're only having to worry about insurance once a year. God only knows why somebody would want to do it more often than that. So you review it once a year, and it's done properly. Then it's all put to bed, and then you can deal with that next year. And as I say, if you've got lots of policies, get rid of all that duplication. There will be admin charges attached to all these policies, so you get rid of that. That's definitely a plus. And we act for a lot of the country's larger short-term providers, including the likes of B&B Buddy, Crabtree and Crabtree, and Retty as well. If you're an agent and you work on behalf of other self-catering providers, we're always more than happy to speak to you to see what we can do. Just a little bit on claims, because at the end of the day, we have nothing to give you other than a promise to pay if something happens. We've got nothing tangible. We don't send you out something fluffy and say, well, that's it, there you go. It's a promise to deliver and to pay when something goes awry. So just a little bit on claims. Almost 50% of our claims are in respect of escape of water. So anybody that works in insurance, has any involvement in insurance, will know that that's very much akin to any property portfolio business. So whether it's a resi property owners or whether it's self-catering, 50% of claims made are in respect of escape of water. Most usually from shower trays or from escape of water from radiators. So insurance companies have, over the last few years, you may see it in your own renewals, they've been trying to mitigate that slightly by increasing the excesses for escape of water claims. That will increase the more that escape of water becomes an issue, because it is quite a damaging claim. The average claim for escape of water is £1,800, and we deal with these every single week, if not every single day. So there are a large number of claims. Interestingly, though, our three largest losses, just to give you some idea of what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, our largest loss that we're currently dealing with was from a gas explosion in Edinburgh. So it didn't affect the client's property. It sits over here. The explosion's over here. Unfortunately, there was a fatality, so it was all quite sad. But our client's property is not allowed to be let out during that period of time. The council haven't decided what on earth they're doing with the property yet, if they're going to reinstate it or what's going to happen. So the client sits in limbo. During that period of time, the client's been compensated through the material damage business interruption section, and they've been compensated for their loss of business during that period of time. And ultimately, the property will be reinstated at some point, and the cost of that will be covered under the policy. That sits with a reserve of 200,000 at the moment, of which 50% of that is actually for business interruption costs. So that's why it's important to have a look at your policy and see, do I have a household policy with lots of additions on it, or do I have a commercially worded policy that will compensate me in the event of a loss? If that client had had one of the 50% of the policies that self-catering owners have, then they wouldn't have had any of their business interruption cover at all. So it's hugely important that they address that whenever they can. One of the other large losses we've got is for damaged underground pipes as a result of tree roots. A lot of our self-catering clients' properties are quite significant amounts of land, and in this particular one, the claim we're sitting at the moment is still to be finalised, but we're sitting at £35,000 for damaged underground pipes. So these are the types of things you don't consider when you're arranging cover, but that's the type of claims that we're dealing with. And another one just earlier on this year, there was bad storms, August time I think it was, and one of our clients has sustained a £44,000 flood cost. So that's what we're dealing with day in, day out. For me though, the one that everybody should have at the forefront of their mind, and again I'm sure Joe will agree, is that is to make sure that your liability cover is in place. We've currently got a claim reserve sitting for £100,000 for injuries sustained by an overweight American tourist that injured himself when the seat collapsed in the client's self-catering accommodation. That's what happened. You know, that's your fault, obviously, because it's nothing to do with the overweight tourist. It's to do with your seat. So that's the type of claims that we get, and we get these a lot. They are normally dealt with under the legal expenses. If not the liability section, you also get a lot of legal expenses claims. One of the other legal expenses claims we've got outstanding at the moment is a client's neighbour has decided to excavate their basement, and there's now cracks on our client's walls. And last week or the week before, the client's back garden collapsed. So that's a legal expenses issue, because it's all to do, and again, Joe knows far more about this than me. I'm not that techie when it comes to the law, but you know, we're talking about party walls and things like that, and that client's got legal expenses covered under the policy. So the cost of taking the neighbour to court and all the rest of it's completely covered under the policy. We sell lots of policies, not just the scheme one, but our scheme one's the only one that includes legal expenses cover. So it's really important that even things like that are considered when you're deciding how you're going to review. So just to say that our claims, we're very grateful. Our claims team are fantastic. They're based in the Edinburgh office, and Trish, who is our claims manager, is very well known in the insurance world, but also in the hospitality sector. Trish is at the forefront of the FCA discussions just now, and if anybody on the call here today has a query or concern or a worry about their own cover that's in place or how they might be able to escalate it, Trish is more than happy to speak to you. You're not a client at the moment, that's fine. You may not ever be a client, but Trish is more than happy to speak to you if you've got any issue. There, in my opinion, humble opinion, there's nobody better qualified than Trish to try and negotiate the claims hurdles that clients are having to deal with at the moment. It's a completely awful time for the sector, and we do appreciate that. I'd just like to thank you for your time this morning. I'm more than happy to answer any questions which might come up later. If I don't have the answer immediately, then I'm more than happy to go and find out the information for you, and I'll pop you an email or come back via Fiona or whatever. But I'd like to again thank the ASSC and Fiona for all their support. Very grateful to them, and back over to you now, Fiona.
Thanks so much, Derek. Well, I have to say that I'd been with the same insurance broker for about 13 years or 14 years maybe when I started running my own self-catering business. And when we started working with Bruce Stevenson back in however many years ago it was, four or so years,
I didn't have to no.
I thought I'd test Derek out. And it transpires that because I diversified my own business quite so much, and we joined we'd bought another self-catering business, and we did, you know, improved the business and so on. Turns out I simply wasn't covered, which was terrifying. But I'm now delighted that I am covered. I'm also one of those statistics that's just put in a claim for water escape. So thanks very much.
What you pay your insurance for? You know?
There you go, bingo, exactly. No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Derek. We've got some questions coming in, which is brilliant. If you've got any questions for Derek or Joe, or indeed me, just pop them in the control bar on the right hand side of your screen, and we'll have a little discussion at the end. Meanwhile, Joe, lovely to see you back. Thank you very much indeed. Do you want to know something? After our last discussion about short-term licensing, when you were with the Autumn Talks last time, over 1,200 people watched the video. Unbelievable. Anyway, you're here to talk about something completely different today. What can you tell us about what we need to do in terms of terms and conditions, or how we can kind of mitigate against any of the horrendous situations we found ourselves in light of this year?
Hi, Fiona. Thank you very much for having me. And yes, that's really quite something, quite a big number there for watching the video. So I hope they weren't disappointed. In terms of uninsured risk, there's a large number, as Derek has said, of things that you can insure for, and the majority of them you can then claim for. And Derek talked about legal expenses cover, which is really important, because one of the issues in terms and conditions isn't so much the fact that things are uninsurable, it's how the terms and conditions are drafted, which then mean things are not clear, which then mean we end up in court. So in terms of the first issue, which Derek had also referred to as liability to guests, now there are certain liabilities that you cannot contract out of. So in your terms and conditions, you should have reference to guest liability and you should have reference to personal injury. But as Derek said, it's really important that you have your public liability cover, and also if you happen to be an employer. I know some of you will not be employers because you perhaps have your own family working in the business, or you do it all yourself. But if you're a multi-site operator, or you have a number of premises in one unit, or indeed it's just that your business isn't your main focus and you perhaps have a day job, so you maybe do need people to come and assist you. So you need to think about employer liability insurance, and that means that you need to identify if you're employing anybody, and you need to be clear on that, because if you have a cleaner, for example, that cleaner might believe that they're an employee, you might believe the cleaner's contracted. So it should be fairly clear, depending on whether the cleaner is receiving wages from you and you're paying their PAYE and employer's national insurance. But even though in your head it's clear, that's not always the case, and it is really important to be clear on that with people that are working with you but are not maybe a spouse or a son or daughter, so are not maybe employed. And even then, even though it's just family, that's quite often here is, well, it's just family, but they are still employees and you still have responsibilities to them. So it is important to make sure that you've got your public liability insurance in place and your employee liability insurance in place, because if there is an injury on your premises, you cannot contract out of your responsibility for that. And I completely appreciate Derek's example of the very overweight guest who broke the chair and then hurt himself. But the fact is, that's what your insurance is there for. So if that individual has hurt himself, if that is because he literally was far too big for the chair and should have known, that's the kind of thing which will come out in court. You need to be covered for that. So the first thing is setting aside perhaps uninsurable risks which can be insured but which can't be contracted out of, are just as important. So looking at uninsurable risks, the terminology is, as I said, perhaps a bit misleading. It's not so much what you can't insure for, but it's what you then perhaps can't recover for under that insurance, because your terms and conditions just haven't supported what you're looking for. And this goes back to being clear. So the first thing I would say is be clear. Use plain English. Divide your terms and conditions into clauses so they don't just run as one big long document, because that can be very confusing for people and visually makes it look quite scary if somebody is reading it. So if you were to go to court, then the court might be critical if your terms and conditions weren't clear. Have clear headings. Think about, before you do them, what you want to achieve. So each individual clause, what's the point of that clause? Because sometimes what it says is not always the same as what you're seeking to achieve from it. So try to make sure that you're focused on what you actually want to achieve by each section of your terms and conditions. State who the parties are. Now that may seem really obvious, but there's a number of issues there. I dealt with litigation for some time in my career. One of the main issues we have is when clients produce a contract, and that's sometimes in inverted commas, saying, I have a contract with this person and I want to raise an action against them. Now that might be something like the Black Bull, and the client has sent invoices to the Black Bull because that's the name of the premises. But the Black Bull is not the person they're contracting with. The premises are actually run by a company called the Black Bull Limited. So strictly speaking, if we're going to raise a court action for money that's outstanding, we need to raise it against the Black Bull Limited. Now, the point for you is to make sure that you are in a position where the parties in your contract are clear. And that can be difficult because the person making the booking is not always your guest. So your terms and conditions do have to state who is responsible. Your terms and conditions must show who the responsible person is for this. And it may not be a person. If you have a big property like Fiona does, then you might get a corporate booking. So your responsible entity might be a limited company. It might be a corporate weekend away. So you need to be sure, first of all, who is the responsible person, who's paying for this? And if it's not paid, or if there is an issue, who do you go to? And the second thing is you need to know your guests, because if there is an issue, particularly at the moment, I think it's made everyone a lot more aware of being aware of who's in the premises. So you really do need to know who your guests are, and I'll go into that a bit more detail in a minute. But identifying the names of the people who are coming, and you then need to decide if that changes. Are you going to make that change? Obviously, it's slightly different, but if you go somewhere in abroad and you have to fly and you want to change the name of the person who's on the booking, then you're charged an admin fee. Now, I know that it's not an industry standard for your industry and it's something you might not want to do, but if you have a big party, then it might be something you want to write into your terms and conditions. You then need to be sure who you are, and that might seem really obvious, but again, this goes back to the Black Bull scenario, except the flip side. Who is running your business? Are you an individual? Is it you and your husband? Is it you and your sister? Now, if it's you and your sister, it might actually be a partnership. Have you set up a limited company? It doesn't have to be the same entity which owns the property. So perhaps the property is owned by your family, perhaps it's inherited and there's 4 siblings own the property, but the other siblings aren't interested in the business and only you run the business. That might mean you're a sole trader. So identifying who you are is really important because you need to be clear on that so that your guests can be clear on that, so they know who they're paying. And then if we need to raise an action because you've not been paid or because there's been damage, we need to know who is either, whose a loss has been incurred by. So we need to understand who you are and that that has been made clear to your guests. So it sounds very straightforward, but again, it can get into a bit of a minefield. You've then got other issues, which again are very much in the forefront at the moment in life in general. So you have to be careful about the way you phrase in terms and conditions who can visit. So you need to first of all look obviously at your numbers and your capacity, and you need to be clear on how many you can take. Does that include infants? Does it include children? If so, what's your definition of children? A child can be somebody who's under 18. For liquor licensing, a child is actually somebody who is 16 or under. So you need to be clear about what is a child. I know some terms and conditions are not keen on having large same-sex groups because it tends to lead to things like stag parties and hen parties. You have to be really careful how you phrase this. I appreciate that none of the members would intend to discriminate, but the way the phrasing is really, really important. So to make sure that you're not phrasing it in an inappropriate manner, you need to, again, to go back to what I said at the beginning. What are you trying to achieve by the clause? If by that clause you're saying we do not welcome hen parties and stag parties, sometimes it is just as well to say that or to put some kind of caveat in where if it is perhaps a hen party, then they come and ask you. And you might get a hen party that doesn't necessarily mean 20-year-olds. It might be somebody who's getting married later in life, and you might be delighted to have 10 older ladies who are going to not create any difficulty. But you need to just be careful about your terminology. You then need to consider things like pets, and you need to be very clear on whether you take pets. Now, I was very interested to hear from somebody I was advising recently who operates a self-catering premises that they accept birds. So they allow people to bring their caged birds if they wish to do so to the property, which I must confess was a pet I hadn't really considered up to that conversation. So from that point of view, you need to consider whether you're going to accept pets. Now, some premises accept no dogs whatsoever, and you need to make that clear because some dogs are not family pets. They are guide dogs or sight assistance dogs, they're hearing dogs, or they're general assistance dogs. So if you do not want pets in general in the premises, that's fine, you can exclude them, but you need to be clear on whether you will then allow assistance dogs, for example, in the premises. You need to consider very carefully the conditions at handover. There is consideration in the new licensing regulations and the legislation that's proposed about the specific handover, and that's one of the things mooted in the mandatory conditions. So you need to consider what you currently do at handover, and that may have to change depending upon what conditions are brought in with the licensing regime. But looking at this from the point of view of the present, you need to be clear on what handover you're doing. So do you do a physical handover? Now that's not always possible, but at some point, do you visit the premises? Because there's some duty of care on you. So if you're not present and you live elsewhere and these premises are let out, then there is still some requirement on you to make sure that you are carrying out some form of due diligence. Your premises take 6 people, but unbeknown to you, 8 people have turned up and they are a hen party or stag party, which is not what you were told. So you need to be able to intervene on that before that goes too far. So I know it's difficult if you don't live near your property, but then you need to put something in place. The team you have who deal with the property for you and maintain or clean the property could then perhaps carry out checks and balances. And again, that has an insurance impact, because if you're not carrying out those checks and balances, if you do have a party of 10 turn up to a property that only takes 6, the fact that you've not done any form of checking to see what's happened after they've checked in then could negate an insurance claim. So you do need to be careful. One of the things people have obviously considered now is coronavirus. So there's all sorts of issues around insuring against pandemics and similar. But a very practical consideration is what happens if you cannot provide the accommodation. And there's 2 aspects to that. Nobody ever anticipated the current situation where you were forcibly closed by the government because of a pandemic. It is as if we're living in a movie some days. So if you're unable to provide the accommodation, then what is the position? Do you refund deposits, for example? What other steps need to be taken there? There has to be a limit on what responsibility or liability that you as the accommodation provider take. Most people, because the situation at the moment is worldwide, it's not limited to the UK or Scotland, it's worldwide. So most people are very understanding of the fact that there are government regulations which are changing in every country, and it may not be possible for you to provide your accommodation despite the fact it's been booked because your government has told you you can't do that. However, what if there was a different situation? What if once we get beyond all this, there are localised outbreaks, or you're simply unwell yourself? If you don't have a team in place because you're a small operation and you are too unwell to be able to provide the accommodation, your terms and conditions need to provide for what happens in that case. And the first thing people quite often think about is, will we refund the deposit? But if you have somebody who has travelled from abroad to stay in your property, and this is an integral part of a bigger holiday for them, then they may then try to seek damages from you. So they may try to seek travel costs, they may try to seek other losses. If it's a very busy time of year and they have had to book in, for example, somewhere else, they may try to seek from you damages, which would be the difference in cost or indeed the full cost of the place they've had to stay in. If they've had to stay somewhere which wasn't as high a rating as yourself, or if it was a completely different type of experience, perhaps your experience is very unique. Perhaps it's an old haunted house or a teepee or something like that. So if your experience is very unique and they've booked it because of that, then you may find that there are other issues, not just as simple as a refund of deposit. And again, these issues, if they're not provided for in your terms and conditions, are potentially uninsurable. So yes, as Derek said, you have legal expenses cover, which is a fantastic option. But if you go to the solicitor who deals with the expenses cover for that insurer, and you say to them you've got a court action against you because the other side are seeking damages, and there's nothing in your terms and conditions about what happens, then their advice may be that you need to settle it. So you cannot guarantee under your legal expenses cover that you will always be able to take the case in hand to its conclusion. The legal expenses cover is only in place, and there's lots of caveats to this, but it's only in place for cases where there are reasonable prospects of success. And unfortunately, until you're in the position where you have an action, the insurance company cannot tell you what reasonable prospects are, because there's far too many different things which could happen. So you do need to make sure you put yourself in the absolute best position you can with your terms and conditions, so that if there are any issues, you are covered. And if you had to make a claim, then your legal expenses would cover that claim. There are lots and lots of other things I could speak to you about in terms of terms and conditions. They could be 3 pages long or 33 pages long. So again, as Derek said, I'm here, I'm happy to speak to people. We're happy to revise these for you, and we've been speaking with Fiona about doing a fixed fee arrangement so that you know exactly what you're looking at to get these revised. Some of your terms and conditions may be perfect, other people may be concerned that some of the things we've looked at aren't covered. From a very practical point of view, there is also no point having your terms and conditions if you don't tell anyone about them. And I know that might seem counterintuitive, but the fact is that a lot of people forget to have their terms and conditions in the emails they're sending out, and they forget then to have the terms and conditions very visible. And I know for yourselves it's very difficult, because gone are the days when I remember my dad, when I was a wee girl many years ago, on teletext and booking holidays on teletext. Now there are so many platforms and so many places that people can make contact with you through. It is important for you to make sure that your terms and conditions are at the forefront of any booking. So when a booking is made, you need to confirm it, and you need to make sure your full terms and conditions are attached. You also need to make sure they're on your website. And if you are sending an email from your own business email, your terms and conditions should be either a document or they should be a link. So there should be a link to your website terms and conditions. That said, you need to then make sure your terms and conditions are the same. So we have had cases where somebody has a set of terms and conditions they send out, but they don't marry up with the terms and conditions on your website. And that's worse than not sending them, because depending on what the differences are, the potential is that you've created confusion, and then people don't actually know which site to go with. So it is really important, first of all, to have them revised and up to date and clear. Second of all, to make sure that you have put everything in them you possibly can, and that your insurances, as Derek said, are up to date. And third, it's really important to make sure your terms and conditions are visible. But if you're going to attach them to documents and have them on your website and give them to rental platforms, you must make sure you use the same document. As I said, happy to speak to folk if you would like to, and there's perhaps too much to discuss on here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And just a big thank you again to Fiona and everyone at the ASSC who puts in so much work to make these talks possible. You don't really see the behind the scenes, but there's lots of planning and checking and techie stuff, and I'm not very good at the techie stuff, so I think I'm probably a bit of a challenge to them. So just a great big thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Jo. That's brilliant. You're perfectly fine at the techie stuff. Brilliant. It's not a question, but Frida Scott Park has put in the questions, but be scared, be very scared. Why do we run these businesses? It's a very good question, to be honest. Birds, yeah, that was another thing I've experienced. I had a bird that was meant to be in a cage. It clearly wasn't in a cage, if you know what I mean, because the entire house recognised that fact. I've also had a 6-year-old tortoise come and stay. She was called Pamela. She spent the week, I think she did 1 turn of the garden in the week. Anyway, it's amazing what people bring with them. People also have horses and so on and so forth. It's extraordinary. We've got some very good questions going on here. One to Jo, relating to what you've just said. Terms and conditions can be changed on a website at the click of a button. Should the T's and C's be logged somewhere else, that you've got a kind of sort of legal backing, that you haven't just zipped into your website and changed them at the last minute?
Usually your IT provider can check, so you should have a record of what happens on your website, and you should be able to track that. You should, as a backup, make sure that whenever you contract with somebody, you're sending them their terms and conditions. So it's not really enough just to say to them, here is the terms and conditions, they're available on the website. You should be sending them out a physical copy, and you should be keeping them yourself in a form where you know when they've been updated. So you should have them saved in somewhere, preferably cloud backed up, so that you know for a fact you're always going to be able to access them, and they should all be dated. And when you change them, don't overwrite the old ones, save them of new, so that if there was something, and I know this might sound ridiculous that claims can go back, but as Derek said, claims can go back some time. So in Scotland, the period of time for someone to raise an action against you is 5 years. In England, it's 6 years. So if somebody wanted to raise an action for injury, for example, they would have 5 years to do that. 3 years to do that. They would also, if somebody had a damages claim, they could raise the action against you within a 5-year period. They should obviously bring the matter to your attention sooner. So if someone goes home and there is an issue, or they've not been able to stay with you, then they know they've got a loss straight away, and yes, they should action that straight away. But from your point of view, what you should be doing is saving your terms and conditions each time, so you've always got the old copy. So if something historic was to raise its head, like Derek's talking about the insurance claim for coronavirus, you would be able to show the insurers your exact terms and conditions at that time. But as I say, it is important when you, no matter where people book through, at some point presumably you have contact with them. So at that point in time, you should be sending them your terms and conditions and making sure that you've got a record of that. So keep those emails with the attachments, even if you put them into a separate document and cloud store them.
Wow, it is complicated, isn't it? There's another question about the same subject. If this person said that we have changed our terms and conditions several times this year, but we're now happy with them, can we send them to existing bookings to ask guests to accept them as updates, or do the original terms and conditions stand in terms of that booking?
You can update them. Obviously, if you have an ongoing contract with somebody, we have clients who we've acted for 25 years. So inevitably, I previously ran my own firm, so they had the terms and conditions for that. Now they've joined Gilson Gray, they have our terms and conditions, and undoubtedly there will be changes to them. So you can change them if you have an ongoing instruction or an ongoing relationship with somebody. If you are going to send updated terms and conditions to people who already have bookings, you need to send them out and you need to get their agreement, and you should also be highlighting to them where the changes are. So it's really unfair, and a court would be very critical if you were just to send out a 10-page terms and conditions document and expect your guest to have time to go through that with a fine-tooth comb and work out where the changes are. So you should make it clear where the changes are, and if there are changes you don't draw their attention to, then they may be at debate if a matter was to be raised upon those specific conditions. Okay,
one last one for you, Jo, and this is really pertinent to those of us with larger properties. Our property sleeps up to 10 and is usually for extended family groups. With COVID in mind, they're often travelling from different areas, and understandably, if one family can't come, then none of them want to come. Any suggestions about how we can write something into our terms and conditions to protect us against that? That's one that I think lots of people want to know.
So is that in terms of if one family can't come, then everybody cancels? Okay.
Yes, as in you can still provide the accommodation, but they don't want to come because there's only 2 of them coming rather than 10 of them.
Yeah, so that's a really common situation, and it's not just one being incurred in the self-catering industry at the moment. Obviously, with the restriction, particularly, well, there's a restriction in numbers on weddings and funerals, but particularly in relation to weddings, a number of people have had weddings booked for huge numbers, and now they can only have 20 or 15. So in terms of that, most of the operators' terms and conditions provided that if the guest cancelled, then they were not refunded their deposit. So what most people have tried to do is to be flexible, particularly at the moment, given that everybody is affected by the pandemic. The way that there's no right way to deal with this, it's entirely at your discretion, and you can phrase your terms and conditions however you wish. So your terms and conditions could say any cancellation, the deposit is forfeited, and for any cancellation prior to, say, 2 days before or 7 days before, once the full payment is taken, the full payment is forfeited. So if you have terms and conditions that say that, and the cancellation has taken place, as long as your terms and conditions are clear, then you can stick to that. Now, you may decide that you don't want to do that because of the current situation. So you may decide that you're going to say, well, we'll keep your deposit, but we'll refund part of the sums. So there is a discretion available to you, regardless of what your terms and conditions say. Going back to the wedding situation, what a lot of providers of hotels and function rooms are doing is saying, if you cancel, we're not refunding your deposit, but we will offer you a wedding just now, for example, for 20, and your bigger reception later. So they're trying to get around it. So again, that's something you might want to do If they cancel, you might want to say, we'll retain your deposit, but we'll give you credit for a visit in the future for the sum that you have already paid us, or we'll refund part of that sum and we'll give you a credit. So it's really a question of how flexible you want to be, and sometimes that might depend on how nice or flexible the guest has been, how they've been about cancelling and similar. But your terms and conditions can cover not quite anything. There are restrictions. As I said, there's things you can't contract out of, but they can cover anything pretty much. And things like how people cancel and what the timescales for cancellation can, of course, be written in. Your decision might not be popular if you decide to retain the full sum paid, but that is up to you as an operator.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Derek, talking of flexible, or in this case, inflexible, various insurance companies were indicating that they would not pay out if the insured had received any government funding, and I know that some of them were withholding any of that grant funding. Is this part of the FCA test case, and do we have any updates on that?
Not as far as I'm aware. It will be up to each insurance company. If an insurance company is asked to pay out the client's claim, somebody can only claim once for a loss. They can only be put in the same financial position after the loss as before the loss occurred. So nobody should actually profit from a situation. So provided somebody hasn't actually profited from the corona, and I'm sure as hell very few self-caterers will have profited at this particular time, but provided somebody's not deemed to be in a better financial position after a loss as before the loss occurred, that's really where the insurance company should make sure that the client isn't at a worse position. I don't have any updates as yet as to how the insurance companies are likely to address that. We will obviously keep you informed. Trish will be able to, she's always ahead of the game in terms of this. She's always giving us the advices that are coming via the FCA, because there's no point in us all doing that job. So that's what Trish is doing across our portfolio of business, not just for self-caterers, but everybody. So when a decision is made, if the insurance companies are then compelled to pay out, they may well ask what assistance has been, financial assistance has been provided to date, just to ensure that we get to a level of parity where you're at the same position as you would have been before the pandemic occurred. Nobody should profit as a result. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense. It's not terribly nice, though, as it would like to benefit out of something here. So what do you think, Derek, how do you envisage your insurance market's going to change after the pandemic? How, what's the landscape going to be? Are we all going to get massive, great big premiums slapped on top of us?
It's a difficult one because everybody at the moment is looking for the sector to do something. They haven't bathed themselves in glory, if I'm being honest, but they are looking for insurers to pay out and step up to the mark. So if that happens, a lot of them won't recover from that. So they will just exit the market and they will never to be seen again. You will also get insurance companies that after the review will decide they no longer want to operate in a particular sector. So they may actively remove themselves from that sector. During this time as well, the market's been affected by loss of confidence, investment returns, etc. as well, the inability to purchase reinsurance. So all of these things will have a negative impact on the market. There's very, very unlikely to be somebody that comes in and offers new policies at this time. You're not likely to find a new carrier. Underwriting capacity will be suppressed. So really, all in all, it's if you take all these things together, it's called a hardening market, and it just means there's a lot of different factors at play that affect the overall appetite to underwrite business. That's not going to be unique to self-catering. That will be across all sectors that have been impacted by the virus. So I think it is going to be a challenging time. I mean, you'll have a lot of people go, well, we want RSA to do this, blah, blah, blah. I mean, RSA is our carrier for our product. But equally, if they are compelled to pay out and they do so, and they might say, well, self-catering for us going forward is a no-no for us. So then I would need to find another capacity provider for our scheme. And is there going to be that capacity provider? at a time of turmoil and uncertainty in the market? I don't know. So we're almost between a rock and a hard place, if the truth be known. So there are going to be challenges. We constantly have discussions with the market, and we look at how we're able to best serve all our clients across all the sectors going forward. So we're not on the back foot, we're always proactive. So we're always looking at opportunities to see who might be best going forward and have those discussions. So it's going to be a challenging time, as it's been for the self-catering sector. Insurance has its own challenges. So a lot of that will become more evident after the court case is settled. I would think we'll start to see a little bit more clarity as to where everybody's, when the dust settles, what everybody intends to do. But underwriting capacity and the availability of reinsurance are going to be the two most important things in determining who is providing your insurance going forward.
Yeah, and I suppose we should be fairly glad that the FCA decided to take this test case, so at least it is being progressed.
It's been escalated quicker than anything ever. You know, yeah. It's real testament to everybody behind the scenes pushing the whole thing forward, all the interested parties making sure that it was given the attention it deserved. In all my years, it's unprecedented, and I hate using that word because Nicol uses it daily, but it's unprecedented. We've never ever seen anything get from A to Z in such a short period of time. So yeah, all credit to everybody involved in that. It has been given the attention it deserves, but far, far quicker than anybody could have predicted.
Indeed, and thanks to everybody that wrote to the FCA with their evidence and pushed and lobbied on our behalf, because we put out a campaign to ask people to do that, and it seems to have worked, so well done. Somebody has asked whether we will be able to provide a kind of terms and conditions pro forma. Now, Joe and I are definitely discussing this, and we're looking at what we can do going forward. So Joe, we'll pick that up and see what we can do. And if there is a benefit in a fixed fee type of arrangement, then we'll discuss that and let everybody know. And I suppose just to end off, by way of an FYI, we're now working with our colleagues down at the Professional Association Self-Caterers, and we're looking to collate a paper looking at various sort of things to do with cancellations and what we can do in light of the Competitions Market Authority ruling regarding post-COVID bookings, and what's the role in booking fees, and is it possibly worth considering a two-tier pricing model like hotels do with either firm or flexible terms, and how could we possibly cover lockdowns and insurance going forward. So we will be producing that in due course once we've compiled it and written it. But I'd like to just say thank you so much to Derek and Joe. It's been absolutely invaluable, really, really fascinating and useful things to listen to and learn from. It has been videoed, and the video will be available later on today or tomorrow. And also, for any of the questions that haven't been answered today, what I'll do is I'll ask Joe and Derek to possibly answer them, and we can distribute those answers in due course. Thank you to everyone that joined us today. And of course, thank you to all our partners of business and everybody that works behind the scenes, including our fabulous Joyce Borthwick that does all the arranging and organisation to make these talks happen and work so seamlessly. And also thanks to Visit Scotland for being our technological support. Next week is our AGM, which sounds quite dry, but it's not just going to be dry, that's going to be very, very quick. And then we've got a real opportunity to have a question and answer session with Riddle Graham, Mark Frothall and Caroline from Agritourism. So please do join us next week and get your questions into us early so that you've got an opportunity to ask these fabulous leaders of tourism what you need to know. But in the meantime, thank you very much again, Derek. Thank you, Joe. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Good afternoon.